I'm Shadi Sharif, and this is Cyborg. Why are we obsessed with gaps? You heard me. Gaps. Gaps, gaps, gaps. Either literal gaps, like the infamous tooth gap, or figurative gaps, like generational ones. Our awareness about the space between emphasizes the differences between us, rather than points of connection. And this can often lead to a battle of the sides. Well, back in my day, or that's so chuggy. But if we want to maintain relationships and community, building bridges are essential. And while some gaps might just require a small metal wire to cross, other gaps seem almost insurmountable, requiring the utmost feats of engineering to even understand where to begin. And I'd argue one such large gap can often be found in immigrant families between parents and kids. I think this is a concept a lot of us can connect with, but might not have thought of it through a psychological and scientific lens. So let me introduce you to the acculturation gap. Basically, just a fancy term that means when there's a difference between how much parents and kids adapt to the culture. So, how much they adopt the practices and values of American culture. More often than not, kids are more acculturated than parents. I can definitely attest to that in my family. And this can lead to a lot of issues, depending on family dynamics. But does it really matter how big the acculturation gap is in families? And if so, what does it affect? In today's episode, I'm going to be chatting with a good friend about her experience with the acculturation gap. And later, I'll discuss what research says this all means. Welcome to Cyborg, Natalie. I first want to ask, how old were you when you came to the US?
So I was almost turning 16, so I was still 15, but a few months before I turned 16. I had very limited English, so I knew the alphabet and how to read, but I didn't even know I was a second semester sophomore when I moved here in high school, sophomore in high school. But I didn't even know how to ask where the bathroom was. And the schools in Iran are so small that you can figure out where to go, but not here. So it took me quite a few weeks until I decided, you know what, I'm gonna go and say toilet because I didn't know how to say where the bathroom was. I found this lady and I said toilet, and she's like, oh, it's right there. And from that day on, I said, you know what, that wasn't that scary. You know, it took me weeks to ask that question, but from that point on, I just started talking, and I didn't care if someone laughed because I told myself I might never see that person again. So who cares if they're laughing?
No, exactly. And I can only imagine how difficult it was to come here in the middle of high school. At that stage of life, we really just want to fit in and be accepted. Do you remember any difficulties you had assimilating to American culture?
Yes, the biggest well, let me start from here. So I tried really hard to assimilate to the culture. I tried practicing words to sound right how I was hearing on TV, you know, trying to lose the accent, trying to use the words that people most commonly use. And I think I want to say when I was in my 20, maybe 2019, when I was 19 years old, when I went to college, I started hanging out or spending time more with the Iranian groups. And I felt like, in a way, I was still not fitting into the American groups because I still struggled with the language and the culture. But in a way, I didn't fit into the Iranian culture and community either, because a lot of people who came at the same time as me, they didn't assimilate as much. And those who were born and raised here were completely different than the ones that immigrated. So I really didn't fit in both cultures at that point. I was
Mm.
somewhere in between. And especially at 19, 20, when you're young, I think women especially, you start self-doubting and you say, okay, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Why am I attracted to dating outside of my culture? You start questioning yourself and hating yourself. Why? And then you get kind of pushed away by certain people more, and that kind of adds to your self questioning. So I spent quite a few years struggling with that because I felt like I was going further and further from uh, the community, but also not really 100% fitting into the American. I still had a lot of friends, but I struggled.
That makes sense. I'm really sorry you had to go through such a difficult period, and you're describing, even at points, disliking things about yourself because of your experiences. I'm curious if you ultimately found yourself gravitating towards one cultural group versus the other.
So I think, yeah, so in my early 20s I did, but I think once I hit 30, I think I realized this is who I am. I have both worlds, and I'm never going to be 100% from one world. 100% have that Iranian culture and 100% American or Caucasian culture maybe. So I think the more I grew uh understanding myself, the more comfortable I was with it. But I think to this day, you still kind of struggle sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people will relate with what you're describing as not feeling 100% in one group or the other, but kind of somewhere in the middle. I'm curious, on the other hand, if you think about your parents' experience, how much did they assimilate to American culture?
So my parents actually went to college here. So it was, well, my mom said that it was different because she went to college in, I think, Boston. So very different than the California lifestyle. But it wasn't a total shock. And they were, my dad is pretty fluent in English and my mom is somewhat fluent. So it wasn't as hard, I don't think, for them. But maybe it was, and I don't know. But now that they're getting older, my mom still, and I think that it's, I think a lot of people might get to that point. I'm curious to know if I would ever. Uh, when you get to a certain age, you want to go back to your roots. So sometimes my mom makes comments that she would love to go move back to Iran.
That's really interesting. I do wonder whether people gravitate more to their home culture as they get older. I'm curious what cultural gaps, if any, existed between you and your parents, and whether you would butt heads on difference of opinions.
No, I that happened a lot, and I moved out. I well before that, I started working at like 16 or 17, and that was a big cultural shock for my parents because you don't really work at that age in Iran. So there was a lot of resistance, but I ended up working, and that helped a lot with the process of assimilating. Um, and so there was that, and then I moved out at 18, and that's a huge no-no in the culture. So I did a lot, and I think it just eventually they just accepted it. But I think it's still hard.
Definitely. It sounds like it took a while for your parents to accept your decisions. Were you able to eventually convince your parents that it's okay to have a job or move out, or did you just make those decisions regardless of their opinion on it?
So my focus of, when I want something, I just focus on that. I kind of just did it, but deep inside, you still hear those words and you review it in your head. And I still, to this day, I don't think my dad completely accepts a lot of the things I do. And he makes comments on it all the time. And it affects you. I think it affects everybody. But I don't think, yeah, I don't think they fully understand. But again, a lot of people don't understand. So I kind of learned to just do what I want,
Right.
but you still feel guilty sometimes.
I can imagine. Did you find it difficult to stay true to your decisions even though your parents didn't support you?
It definitely was. And again, that brings a lot of guilt, and that guilt can transform to other anxiety and panic and other things, and you self questioning, and going back to maybe it's me, maybe everybody's different, and everybody is still holding on to certain values. So yeah, there was a lot. It was pretty
Mhm.
difficult, and I think I still feel that way.
That makes sense. I can only imagine how difficult it is going through that process. And as humans, we just want to be accepted. So, being in a situation where we feel like our parents aren't accepting us, but also other people seem to be able to hold on to this culture that you want to break away from, and having this feeling of being the odd one out. I'm curious how this affected your sense of identity, if in any way.
Yes, I think there was a big part of me, because a lot of times I compared the relationship that my sister has with my parents, and she's very much very traditional and has different values than me. Uh, Not necessarily to say one is better than the other. It's just different, more traditional. Um, so I think I sometimes did think, and still do, that maybe, again, going back to self-doubt, maybe it's me. Maybe I should have uh, been different.
That makes sense. I can only imagine how difficult it was with the added layer of your sister also not being as assimilated. I'm curious, do you think your family dynamic would have been better if your parents were more Americanized, more assimilated, and this acculturation gap was smaller?
I don't know if the Americanized would have, if they were more Americanized, it would have been better. I think it just in your personality. Some people are more accepting, and I think my mom, for instance, is has that free spirit that maybe she tried to hide in Iran and still
Mhm.
does. But deep inside, she was more free spirited like me. So I think deep inside she understands, and that even though I don't think she's very much assimilated yet, but I think that it all depends on that person's personality. Um, I think when you move to a new country at an older age, it's a little harder to transform.
I definitely agree with you that the younger a person is when they migrate, the easier it is for them to assimilate to the new culture. Especially when we're thinking about young people and kids, they're still trying to develop their identity, they're trying to identify their values, and they have the opportunity to grow up in a new area and accept the new things around them. I also really find your point about assimilation super interesting. So basically, you're saying that it's not necessarily that parents need to be a lot more assimilated or that the acculturation gap needs to be smaller, but it's just that parents need to have an open mind to new ideas that are different than their own beliefs. So I'm curious, if you were to give advice to immigrant parents on assimilation and acculturation, what would you say? Would you recommend parents fully immerse in American culture and that be the culture they practice at home, or somewhere in the middle?
No, I think part of, because you can't change how you look and where you came from, and you have to still love that part of you. And I would encourage going to Iran if they can, and learning. And I would focus on teaching all the good things about our culture, which is, there's a lot. But I think if you hide away from learning about the culture, you are not loving yourself and knowing yourself as much, because just going back to the generational traits that transfer, there might be a lot that you might understand more if you learn the culture.
Generational gaps between parents and kids exist in all families. But there's an added layer of difficulty for immigrant kids, because not only do they need to contend with different generational understandings, but also they potentially need to contend with fundamental cultural differences, differences in morals, differences in values. And as Natalie described, there were fundamental differences in what her and her parents deemed acceptable. And her experience was compounded by the fact that her older sister was traditional and less acculturated as well. When I first decided to focus an episode on the acculturation gap, I assumed to find research showing that larger acculturation gaps are a bad thing. I thought they impacted kids' mental health and identity development. But as research has shown me time and time again, it's not that black and white. And actually, there's a high probability my hypothesis might be wrong. So during the 90s and early 2000s, psychologists wrote various theories on the negatives of the acculturation gap. They theorized that a difference in how much parents and kids assimilate to American culture results in stress and conflict, family erosion, and mental health difficulties. But over the last decade, researchers have conducted more in-depth studies examining these theories, and the results are mixed. So while some studies have found an indirect link with an acculturation gap and depressive symptoms, no study has found a direct, strong association. What researchers are finding really matters is actually the family dynamic, aka family conflict. So I know we've all experienced tussles with our family. It's a completely normal thing. But family conflict can be higher in some contexts than others. And researchers find that when family conflict is high, that's where the problem really lies. So family conflict in immigrant families is connected with disruptive behaviors and lower mental health functioning in their kids. So while many families have an acculturation gap, without the family conflict, these negative risk factors don't seem to apply. Okay, but how can there be an acculturation gap without conflict? Well, maybe some parents don't necessarily impose their culture on their kids. Or possibly some kids maintain a persona around their parents to keep them at ease, where in the home they adhere to their parents' culture, but outside they follow their own ideals. Or potentially, kids who already struggle with their mental health also tend to have greater family conflict. Teasing these hypotheses apart, though, is difficult, and further research is needed. But what's clear is that your parents' acculturation, or lack thereof, most likely did not relate to your overall well-being. I can hear the parents releasing a sigh of relief in the back. But since the research isn't solidified, I'm curious about your thoughts. Do you think the acculturation gap really matters when it comes to families and kids? While the jury's out, maybe these results so far suggest our obsessions with gaps are misplaced. Maybe, just maybe, we should focus on mending the gap instead. Intro music was written by Optin Akrami. And if you're interested in the research I referenced, you can find a complete list on our website at cyborg.info.